March 27, 2020. The CARES Act passes the Senate 96-0. $2 trillion approved in under 3 hours. The bill runs 880 pages. No senator read it. No amendments were proposed. The largest spending package in American history sailed through without debate because it was classified as an emergency. But the $2 trillion Congress approved was only what the public saw. Simultaneously, the Federal Reserve activated 9 separate lending facilities outside the congressional budget process: the Secondary Market Corporate Credit Facility, the Primary Market Corporate Credit Facility, the Municipal Liquidity Facility. Within 3 months, these programs created $4.7 trillion, not borrowed, created. The money appeared on the Fed's balance sheet as purchased assets. It never showed up in the federal budget. Congress authorized $2 trillion. The Fed created $4.7 trillion more. That's $6.7 trillion in total, and only 30% of it went through normal oversight. This wasn't new. Since 1991, the federal government has designated $12.5 trillion as emergency spending. That money moved through channels designed to bypass standard budget controls. The emergency designation exempts spending from debt limits, from pay-as-you-go rules, from the normal appropriations process. What was built as a safety valve for genuine crises has become the primary method of government finance. The system isn't hidden, it's codified in law, and it's accelerating. Emergency spending exists in federal law as an exemption. The Balanced Budget and Emergency Deficit Control Act established statutory limits on discretionary spending. Congress cannot exceed these caps without consequences, but the law includes a clause. Spending designated as an emergency doesn't count against the caps. The Office of Management and Budget created 5 criteria to qualify as emergency spending. The expenditure must be necessary, sudden, urgent, unforeseen, and temporary. These seem strict. They're not enforced. Congress routinely designates predictable, recurring expenses as emergencies. Annual disaster relief, classified as unforeseen. Multi-year military operations, classified as temporary. Long-term entitlement programs, classified as urgent. The criteria exist on paper. In practice, any spending Congress wants to exempt from budget limits can be labeled an emergency. The scale of abuse is measurable. Between 1991 and 2024, Congress designated $12.5 trillion as emergency spending. This created an additional $2.5 trillion in interest costs. The total, $15 trillion, equals all Medicaid and veterans spending combined over the same period. In the past decade, emergency spending has grown to 11% of total budget authority. Half of that is mandatory spending, meaning it continues automatically without annual approval. 5 laws account for 87% of mandatory emergency spending. 3 responded to the 2008 financial crisis. 2 responded to COVID. Each crisis expanded the definition of emergency. Each expansion became permanent infrastructure. The emergency loophole transformed from exception to standard procedure. Understanding how money moves invisibly requires examining 2 mechanisms: off-budget designation and special purpose vehicles. Off-budget designation is official. Congress formally excludes certain programs from unified budget calculations. Social Security trust funds are off-budget. The Postal Service Fund is off-budget. The rationale was protection. Removing Social Security from standard budget discussions would prevent its surplus from being diverted to other programs. The opposite occurred. Because high-level budget debates focus on the unified deficit, Social Security surpluses effectively masked deficits elsewhere. The trust fund accumulated $2.9 trillion in Treasury bonds by 2020. That money was already spent. The government borrowed from Social Security to fund other operations, then issued bonds to itself as IOUs. The accounting shows a surplus in Social Security, while the operational reality is that the surplus financed deficit spending across the rest of the government. The off-budget designation didn't protect Social Security. It obscured the actual deficit. Special purpose vehicles operate differently. These are distinct legal entities created during crises to hold assets or liabilities separate from the parent organization's balance sheet. During COVID, the Federal Reserve established multiple SPVs to manage emergency lending programs. The Treasury funded these vehicles using CARES Act appropriations. By September 2020, SPVs had invested $96 billion in Treasury-issued securities that don't trade publicly and don't appear on standard government financial reports. Federal accounting standards classify SPVs as disclosure entities. They must be reported, but they're not consolidated into the government's primary financial statements. The fragmentation is intentional. Different agencies use different accounting methods. Treasury uses cash accounting, the Fed uses accrual accounting, SPVs use mark-to-market for some assets and historical cost for others. No unified standard exists. This makes calculating the government's true financial position impossible. The system isn't designed for transparency. It's designed for flexibility, which produces opacity as a byproduct. The 2008 financial crisis established the template. When Lehman Brothers collapsed in September, credit markets froze. Banks stopped lending to each other. The commercial paper market, which funds corporate payroll, seized. Treasury Secretary Henry Paulson and Fed Chairman Ben Bernanke told Congress the financial system would collapse within days without intervention. Congress passed the Troubled Asset Relief Program. TARP authorized $700 billion to purchase toxic assets from banks. The final commitment reached $448.5 billion. That spending was visible. It appeared in the budget. The public debated it. But TARP was only part of the response. The Federal Reserve, operating under Section 1303 of the Federal Reserve Act, created multiple emergency lending facilities. The commercial paper funding facility peaked at $348.2 billion in outstanding loans on January 21, 2009. The term asset-backed securities loan facility lent against asset-backed securities. The primary dealer credit facility provided overnight loans to investment banks. These facilities created $3.7 trillion between September 2008 and June 2010. The Fed purchased assets by crediting bank accounts with newly created money. No appropriation from Congress. No public debate. The transactions appeared on the Fed's balance sheet, but not in the federal budget. The public didn't learn the full scale until 2010 when Congress mandated disclosure through Dodd-Frank. Bloomberg News sued under the Freedom of Information Act to force release of recipient data. The Fed fought the lawsuit for 2 years. When the data emerged, it showed the Fed had lent $7.7 trillion to domestic and foreign banks during the crisis. The number shocked even members of Congress who voted for the emergency programs. But the money had already moved. Who received the funds matters. Research analyzing TARP distribution found that institutions with political connections received systematically better terms. Banks that lobbied Congress, donated to campaigns, or whose executives had government relationships got larger bailouts faster. Political proximity became the most valuable asset during the crisis. The emergency structure enabled this. Speed was prioritized over scrutiny. The result was the largest transfer of public money to private institutions in American history, allocated partly based on political access rather than purely financial need. The moral hazard was explicit. Institutions deemed too big to fail were insulated from losses. The implicit guarantee encouraged excessive risk. Banks knew future crises would trigger bailouts. The incentive structure rewarded gambling with public money as the backstop. COVID-19 produced an emergency response that dwarfed 2008. The Paycheck Protection Program and Economic Injury Disaster Loans disbursed approximately $1.2 trillion through the Small Business Administration. The stated goal was preserving employment at small businesses. The program was credited with saving an estimated 48 million jobs. But the SBA Office of Inspector General concluded the agency lacked an established internal control environment. The pursuit of speed eliminated basic verification. The quantitative result was catastrophic. The OIG estimated over $200 billion in potentially fraudulent disbursements. The PPP lost approximately $64 billion, representing 8% of total funds. The EIDL program lost approximately $136 billion, representing 17% of disbursed funds. Those aren't projections. They're the Inspector General's estimates of money already stolen. The fraud wasn't opportunistic individuals. It was organized criminal enterprises. Federal investigators uncovered rings that obtained over $20 million in forgivable PPP loans using fake businesses. The conspirators created shell companies, applied for loans, wrote checks to non-existent employees, and cashed them through affiliated businesses. The money vanished into the criminal economy. Facilitators emerged to profit from the chaos. Renetta Golden Larimore prepared 43 false PPP applications. She charged between $2,000 and $7,000 per application. She created counterfeit IRS forms, showing inflated income for existing businesses or fabricated revenue for companies that didn't exist. Her operation alone caused over $900,000 in losses. The structural design created the fraud. PPP loans were forgivable if borrowers met payroll requirements. The application process was deliberately simplified to accelerate distribution. Verification was minimal. The SBA approved loans in hours. The combination of immediate cash availability, minimal oversight, and automatic forgiveness created overwhelming economic incentive to defraud the system. The fraud epidemic was predictable. The Inspector General warned Congress in real time. Recommendations to implement stronger controls were ignored because they would slow disbursement. The political priority was getting money out fast, regardless of who received it. The long-term moral hazard extended beyond initial fraud. The SBA analyzed cost-effectiveness of pursuing collection on defaulted loans under $100,000. The analysis suggested many small defaults wouldn't justify the administrative expense of collection. By signaling that smaller loans might not be aggressively pursued, the government created an accountability gap. Borrowers learned that consequences for non-repayment were weak. This undermines the integrity of future disaster programs. The precedent is set. Emergency money comes with minimal verification and weak enforcement. Tracking recipients is difficult because the money disperses through intermediaries. The Fed lends to banks. Banks lend to corporations. Corporations spend on operations or return cash to shareholders. The flow is visible only at the first transaction. During COVID, corporate bond purchases by the Federal Reserve kept borrowing costs near historic lows. The secondary market corporate credit facility bought existing corporate bonds. This didn't fund new investment. It provided liquidity to bondholders, mostly financial institutions and mutual funds. Corporations responded by issuing new debt at 2% interest rates. Between 2020 and 2021, S&P 500 companies spent over $1 trillion on stock buybacks. Apple bought back $90 billion. Microsoft bought back $60 billion. ExxonMobil, despite reporting pandemic losses, bought back $12 billion. The connection is indirect but clear. Emergency Fed programs suppressed interest rates. Corporations borrowed cheaply. The cash funded buybacks, enriching shareholders and executives, while employees faced layoffs and wage cuts. The Fed's intervention stabilized markets, but the gains flowed overwhelmingly to asset holders. Emergency spending also flows internationally. During 2008, the Fed lent over $600 billion to foreign banks through currency swap lines. During COVID, that increased beyond $1 trillion. Central banks in Europe, Japan, and South Korea received dollars to stabilize their banking systems. These transactions don't appear in U.S. budget documents. They're classified as international monetary cooperation, not spending. The Fed creates dollars, lends them to foreign central banks, and when repaid, destroys the dollars. But while outstanding, trillions circulate globally with zero congressional authorization. The public never voted on lending $1 trillion to foreign central banks. Congress never appropriated the funds. The Fed activated existing authorities and executed the transactions. The money moved invisibly across borders to support financial systems in other countries. Emergency spending creates false indicators of economic stability. GDP includes government expenditures. When the government creates $2 trillion and distributes it, that spending counts as economic activity even though it's financed through debt or monetary creation. It inflates GDP without representing productive growth. During COVID, GDP fell sharply in Q2 2020, then recovered by Q4 2020. The recovery wasn't organic. Emergency spending supported consumption. Stimulus checks went directly to households. PPP loans covered business payroll. Enhanced unemployment benefits replaced lost wages. When these programs ended, consumption fell. The recovery was artificial, sustained only while emergency money flowed. Employment statistics followed the same pattern. Unemployment dropped from 14.8% in April 2020 to 6.7% by December 2020. But much of that employment was subsidized. PPP loans were forgiven if businesses maintained payroll. Companies kept workers not because of revenue, but because the government covered wages. When forgiveness criteria expired, many jobs disappeared. The stock market provides the clearest example. The S&P 500 fell 34% from February to March 2020. By August 2020, it had fully recovered. By January 2022, it hit record highs. The rally wasn't driven by corporate earnings. Earnings fell during COVID. The rally was driven by liquidity. The Fed's bond purchases kept interest rates near zero. With bonds yielding nothing, investors moved capital into stocks. Asset prices inflated. When the Fed stopped purchasing bonds in 2022 and raised rates, the S&P fell 25% within 9 months. The emergency infrastructure props up markets. Investors operate with an implicit assumption that the Fed will intervene to prevent major losses. This assumption encourages risk. Knowing that bailouts will arrive, institutions take larger positions with more leverage. The expected intervention becomes self-fulfilling. Markets destabilize. Emergency programs activate, and the pattern repeats. The crisis response system no longer turns off. The Federal Reserve's balance sheet held $870 billion in assets in 2007. After the 2008 crisis, it expanded to $4.5 trillion by 2014. The Fed attempted to reduce it. Quantitative tightening began in 2017. By August 2019, the balance sheet had fallen to $3.7 trillion. Then repo markets seized in September 2019, months before COVID. Overnight lending rates spiked. The Fed immediately reversed course and began expanding the balance sheet again. COVID accelerated the expansion. The balance sheet peaked at $8.9 trillion in April 2022. As of 2024, it remains at $7.5 trillion. The Fed has never returned to pre-crisis levels. The emergency infrastructure is permanent. The legal authorities exist. The facilities can be activated within 48 hours. The precedent is established. When Silicon Valley Bank collapsed in March 2023, the Fed created the Bank Term Funding Program within 2 days. The program lent $165 billion to banks using Treasury bonds as collateral. No congressional vote, no public debate. The crisis happened on a Thursday. The program was operational by Monday. Emergency spending merged with routine policy. The distinction between crisis intervention and standard operations disappeared. Markets now expect intervention. The Fed's credibility depends on meeting those expectations. Refusing to intervene would cause immediate market panic. The system created its own necessity. The accounting hides the scale. The national debt is $36 trillion. That includes Treasury bonds held by the public and by government accounts. It doesn't include the Fed's holdings. The Fed owns $4.8 trillion in Treasury securities and $2.3 trillion in mortgage-backed securities. Those assets were purchased with created money. The Treasury issued bonds, the Fed bought them, the government spent the proceeds. Standard economics calls this monetization. The government prints money to finance itself, but legal technicalities separate it. The Fed is nominally independent. Its purchases are monetary policy, not fiscal spending. The effect is identical. The government spends money created specifically to enable that spending. When the Fed earns interest on Treasury bonds, it remits most of the profit back to the Treasury. In 2021, the Fed sent $109 billion to the Treasury. That's interest the government paid itself. The money flowed in a circle. If the Fed's Treasury holdings were counted as government debt, the real total would exceed $40 trillion. But because they're classified as central bank assets, they're invisible in standard debt calculations. The accounting creates the appearance of separation, while the reality is complete integration. Emergency spending operates through this hidden architecture. The official debt is $36 trillion. The actual financial exposure, including loan guarantees, insurance programs, and Fed holdings, exceeds $50 trillion. The difference is how the accounting classifies obligations. The exposure is real. The reporting is fragmented. The 18 trillion figure referenced in emergency spending debates represents cumulative designations since 1991. It's not a single fraudulent transaction. It's the total of 3 decades of crisis appropriations, each bypassing standard budget controls, each adding to structural debt, each creating precedent for the next emergency. The system functions exactly as designed. Congress can't respond to genuine crises through normal appropriations. The process is too slow. Emergency authorities allow rapid deployment of massive resources. That's necessary. But the authorities are no longer reserved for genuine emergencies. They're invoked for predictable needs, for political convenience, for avoiding difficult budget negotiations. The emergency designation became a loophole, and loopholes expand until they're closed. This one has never been closed. The consequences are measurable. Federal interest payments exceeded $1 trillion in 2024. That's more than the defense budget. Every dollar spent on interest is a dollar unavailable for infrastructure, education, or any productive use. The debt service grows faster than the economy. At current trajectory, interest payments will consume 20% of federal revenue by 2030. That money pays creditors. It doesn't build anything. The invisible tax is inflation. Excessive government spending beyond productive capacity drives prices up. Since 2020, cumulative inflation exceeded 20%. The dollar lost 1/5 of its purchasing power in 4 years. That's the real cost of emergency spending. It's not a line item in the budget. It's the erosion of every dollar in your bank account, every dollar of your salary, every dollar of your savings. The government has no money of its own. It finances spending through explicit taxes or through inflation, which is an implicit tax that hits everyone but shows up nowhere. The emergency spending system guarantees permanent inflation because it guarantees permanent monetary expansion. The cycle is self-reinforcing. Emergency spending creates debt. Debt creates interest costs. Interest costs require more borrowing. More borrowing eventually requires monetary financing. Monetary financing creates inflation. Inflation erodes purchasing power and destabilizes the economy. Destabilization triggers the next emergency. And the next emergency activates the same spending authorities that caused the previous crisis. The system doesn't solve problems. It perpetuates them. Each intervention creates the conditions requiring the next intervention. The architecture of evasion, built over 3 decades, survives because it serves political interests. Emergency spending allows politicians to deliver benefits without raising taxes. The cost is deferred. Future generations will service the debt. Future workers will experience the inflation. But current politicians gain credit for the spending. The incentive structure guarantees abuse. No politician wants to be the one who said no during a crisis. No Congress wants responsibility for limiting emergency aid, so the authorities remain unlimited. The spending continues, and the accounting ensures the public never sees the full cost until years later when the debt and inflation are irreversible.